fluorescent light above me flickered, buzzing like it knew something I didn't want to admit, and the silver tray in my hands felt heavier than it should have. Music seeped through the ballroom doors, champagne laughter riding the air, while my pulse thudded in my ears, loud enough to drown out everything else. I remember the smell of polished floors and perfume, the way my reflection in the narrow mirror looked like a stranger wearing my face. If you've ever trusted someone completely and felt that trust slip without a sound, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. Stories like this don't happen in isolation. I stood there, invisible on purpose, realizing I wasn't here to serve or to belong. I was here to see the truth with my own eyes, no matter how sharp it cut. The moment I stepped forward, I understood that my life had already split into before and after. Let me show you how it all began. I was standing in a narrow service hallway of a luxury hotel in Charleston, wearing a black vest that didn't belong to my life. The fluorescent light above me flickered, and for a moment I felt like the walls were breathing, closing in, waiting for me to decide whether I would walk forward or run. 3 months earlier, I would never have imagined myself here. I was used to boardrooms, polished conversations, and being seen. That night, my job was to disappear, to move quietly, to watch. The sounds from the ballroom spilled through the doors in soft waves of laughter and music. Every note felt heavier than the last. I held a tray in my hands, steady on the outside, while something inside me kept slipping. I already sensed what I was about to find, but sensing and seeing are very different kinds of pain. I hadn't come here for answers spoken out loud. I came because silence had started to feel dishonest. Somewhere between the polished floors and the murmured voices, I understood that my life was about to split into before and after. I took a breath and reminded myself why I was here, not to interfere, not to make a scene. I was here to confirm what my heart had been warning me about for weeks. I used to think of my life as carefully built and quietly successful. I worked as a senior strategy consultant, the kind of job where people trusted me to see patterns before they became problems. I liked structure, preparation, and calm solutions. Chaos made me uncomfortable, and maybe that mattered more than I realized. My marriage looked the same way from the outside. Ethan and I had routines, shared calendars, and polite affection. We didn't fight. We didn't raise our voices. We talked about plans and responsibilities, and I mistook that for intimacy. Stability felt like proof that we were doing something right. Over time, small changes appeared, the kind you explain away because explaining is easier than feeling afraid. He stayed later at work. He became protective of his phone. He seemed restless in ways I couldn't quite name. I told myself it was pressure, ambition, the normal cost of building a future. I had built my career on recognizing shifts before others noticed them, yet at home I chose comfort over clarity. I convinced myself that trust meant not looking too closely. I thought peace was something you preserved by ignoring questions. Looking back, the signs were already lining up, quiet and patient. I just wasn't ready to see them yet. That changed the moment something landed in my hands that no explanation could smooth over. It was small, ordinary, and impossible to ignore. And it forced me to admit that my carefully balanced life was already leaning toward collapse, long before that night arrived without warning quietly. I found the invitation folded inside Ethan's jacket pocket while I was hanging it back in the closet. It was thick, cream-colored, and heavier than it needed to be. An exclusive charity gala. Invitation only. Formal dress required. What caught my attention wasn't the elegance. It was the line that quietly stated spouses were not included. I remember standing there longer than necessary, holding that piece of paper like it might explain itself if I waited. When I asked about it later, The explanation came easily. It was just work, just donors, just conversations I wouldn't enjoy. On the surface, it sounded reasonable. That's what made it dangerous. Reasonable explanations can still be wrong. My discomfort wasn't emotional, it was logical. People don't suddenly become careful, distant, and reinvented for events that don't matter. They don't exclude the person they share a life with unless there's something to separate. I noticed how quickly the subject changed after that. How neatly the invitation disappeared. I told myself I was overthinking, because that was easier than admitting I was being deliberately left out of part of his life. That moment didn't break anything. It clarified something. Trust didn't vanish all at once. It shifted, quietly. I stopped asking questions that could be smoothed over. I stopped seeking reassurance. Instead, I started paying attention, choosing to watch rather than confront. Because some truths reveal themselves only when you give them enough space to move. That decision marked the beginning of silence that felt heavier, sharper, and far more intentional than any argument. I wanted to confront him immediately. The urge came fast and sharp, like a reflex I'd trained myself to use in every other part of my life. When something didn't add up, I addressed it. I asked questions. I resolved it. But this wasn't a client problem or a work mistake. This was my marriage, and reacting too quickly felt like handing over control I wasn't ready to lose. So I chose silence, even though it came at a cost. Holding back meant carrying the weight alone, replaying moments, second-guessing my instincts, pretending nothing had shifted. I smiled when I needed to, listened when I felt numb, and reminded myself that restraint was not weakness. It was discipline. I realized that confrontation would only give him a chance to adjust, to explain, to erase tracks I hadn't even seen yet. Observation, on the other hand, required patience. It meant watching patterns instead of promises, behavior instead of words. It meant trusting my ability to see clearly without being seen. That was when something changed inside me. My fear softened into focus. My hurt turned into awareness. I stopped needing reassurance and started collecting clarity. By the time the night of the gala approached, I wasn't trembling anymore. I was steady. I wasn't going there to accuse or beg for honesty. I was going to watch carefully, because whatever was happening no longer needed my questions. It was ready to reveal itself, and I knew the truth would not be gentle when it finally stepped into the light for me. I saw Ethan the moment he stepped into the ballroom. I would have recognized him anywhere, even if I had been blindfolded. What I didn't expect was the woman walking beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, moving with a familiarity that made my chest tighten before my mind could catch up. They didn't rush. They didn't scan the room. They moved like people who belonged there together. His hand hovered near her back, not touching, but ready. She leaned toward him when he spoke, her body already angled in, already claiming space beside him. Nothing about it felt new. It felt practiced. I stayed still, my face calm, my breathing measured, while something inside me cracked open slowly. I watched how he smiled differently, softer, proud in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. I noticed how she listened, how she didn't need explanations. They spoke the same unspoken language. Then I saw it. When a server passed with champagne, she declined without hesitation and rested her hand briefly against her stomach. The gesture was small, almost invisible, but it landed like a blow. In that instant, suspicion collapsed into certainty. There was nothing left to interpret. What hurt most wasn't just them. It was everyone else. The knowing looks, the polite nods, the way conversations flowed around them without surprise. This wasn't a secret being hidden. It was a truth already absorbed by the room. I realized then that I wasn't uncovering something fragile. I was walking into something established, something that had been living and growing while I was still trying to preserve a version of my life that no longer existed. I didn't feel dramatic. I felt late to the truth, late to my own awareness. And as I stood there, invisible and steady, I understood that whatever I did next could not happen in public. It had to happen somewhere quiet, where I could think clearly and decide who I would be after this moment finally finished breaking me. I stepped out of the ballroom and into the service hallway before my face could betray me. The door closed softly behind me, and the noise dulled into a distant hum. The air felt cooler there, cleaner, like the building itself was giving me space to breathe. I placed my hand against the wall and stood still, not collapsing, not crying, just stopping long enough to steady myself. I understood, very clearly, that if I broke down now, I would lose something I might never get back: control, perspective, time. This wasn't the moment for questions or explanations. I already had enough answers. What I needed was proof, something solid, something that couldn't be denied, reinterpreted, or smoothed over with charm and excuses. I thought about all the times I had trusted my instincts at work and ignored them at home. I promised myself I wouldn't make that mistake again. Pain doesn't disappear when you ignore it, but it can be redirected. I felt it shifting, settling into focus instead of panic. I reached for my phone with steady hands and made a decision I hadn't planned, but somehow already knew I would make. I wasn't asking anyone to tell me what I already suspected. I was asking for help uncovering the full truth. As I straightened my shoulders and prepared to walk back through those doors, I wasn't a wife waiting to be hurt again. I was someone who understood systems, leverage, and timing. Whatever happened next would be quiet, deliberate, and irreversible. The plan had begun. I moved through the days after that night with a calm that surprised even me. On the surface, nothing changed. I went to work, answered messages, shared meals. Inside, everything was aligning. Evidence doesn't arrive all at once. It accumulates. A pattern here, a confirmation there. Dates, locations, expenses, timelines. I didn't chase details with desperation. I let them come to me, documented, organized, preserved. Each piece replaced emotion with clarity. The more I gathered, the quieter I became. Anger didn't disappear, but it stopped leading. I understood that facts carry weight. Feelings never can. Proof doesn't argue. It simply exists. What shifted everything was realizing how much protection already surrounded me. Agreements we had signed years earlier. Structures designed for stability that now worked in my favor. I had never paid them much attention because I never imagined needing them. Now they mattered. Patience became my advantage. Silence became space. While he moved freely, assuming nothing had changed, I prepared carefully. Timing wasn't about revenge. It was about accuracy, about making sure that when the truth surfaced, it stood on its own without explanation. By then, I no longer felt like someone waiting to be hurt again. I felt anchored, informed, ready. The outcome was no longer emotional. It was procedural. I knew that by the time he noticed my distance, by the time questions finally reached the surface, everything important would already be decided. The work was done. All that remained was to leave quietly, at the moment when action would speak louder than any confrontation ever could. I understood that preparation was not cruelty, but self-respect. I wasn't erasing him from my life in anger. I was protecting myself with intention. When the morning came, it would arrive calmly. carrying consequences already set in motion, untouched by emotion, grounded in truth alone, and ready for the visible change that would follow next without hesitation, doubt, regret. I wasn't there when he came home that morning. The house spoke for me instead. Silence hung in every room, clean and unmistakable, the kind that tells you something has ended without raising its voice. I had taken only what belonged to me, my clothes, my personal files, the objects that carried memory rather than value. The closets were orderly, not emptied in anger. My side was simply gone, as if it had never been meant to stay. The walls were bare where my photographs once hung. Shelves that held my books stood lighter, breathing. The kitchen was untouched. No notes, no explanations, no dramatics waiting on the counter. I didn't want confusion. I wanted clarity. On the bedroom nightstand, I left two things: my wedding ring, placed carefully, not thrown aside, and an envelope thick enough to be taken seriously. Inside was not emotion. It was information, dates, documentation, decisions already made. I imagined him moving through the house slowly, noticing absence before understanding it, confusion before panic. There was nothing left to argue with, no words to twist, no scene to control. Leaving that way wasn't about punishment. It was about closure. I didn't erase him from my life in a moment of anger. I exited with intention, making room for consequences to arrive without my presence. That morning marked the end of who he thought I was, and it quietly prepared the ground for the truth he never knew about me to finally surface. It was calm, deliberate, and finished. What followed would not unfold in conversation, but in revelation. The silence I left behind was temporary. The impact it carried was not. That realization would reach him soon enough, reshaping everything he believed about control itself. I realized then that Ethan never truly knew me. He knew the version I offered, the one that fit neatly into his life, not the full context that shaped mine. I had learned early that power speaks loudest when it does not announce itself. My family background was never a secret, but it was never a headline either. I grew up around balance sheets, boardrooms, and quiet ownership. Influence was discussed softly at dinner, not celebrated. When I built my own career, I did it deliberately, choosing independence over inheritance, credibility over shortcuts. I never hid that part of myself out of shame. I hid it because I wanted to be chosen without leverage. I wanted love without calculation. Ethan never asked deeper questions, and I never corrected the assumptions he made. When the truth reached the right places, it did not arrive with drama. It arrived with documentation, signatures, and meetings that continued without him. I stepped into those rooms calmly, not as a wife seeking sympathy, but as someone with standing and responsibility. What followed was not revenge. I did not dismantle his life. I simply stopped shielding him from the systems he believed he controlled. Accountability has a way of multiplying once it is allowed to exist. By the time he understood what was happening, the outcome no longer depended on me. Processes moved forward. Reviews unfolded. Decisions stacked quietly on top of one another. I didn't take anything from him. I removed myself from the role of protector. And once I did, consequences began to travel far beyond our marriage, continuing on their own timeline long after my silence had already done its work. That shift marked the moment my life stopped shrinking and started expanding. I thought the hardest part was over once the truth surfaced. In reality, that was only the beginning. Consequences rarely arrive all at once. They unfold the way weather changes, slowly, then all around you. At first, he tried to regain control. Emails sent late at night, calls placed to people who used to answer, explanations offered where no one was asking anymore, watching from a distance. I saw the same pattern repeat itself. When fear shows up, some people mistake movement for strategy. What he didn't understand was that every attempt to push back created more record, more confirmation, more reason for systems to keep moving without him. Silence would have helped him. Action exposed him. Reviews turned into audits. Questions turned into procedures. Decisions were made by people who had no interest in our history or emotions. They cared about facts, timelines, and responsibility. Once that process starts, it doesn't look for permission to continue. Time did the rest. Opportunities closed quietly. Trust thinned. Invitations stopped arriving. None of it happened in a single dramatic moment, and that made it impossible to fight. I didn't follow every detail. I didn't need to. The outcome was no longer tied to my attention. What mattered was understanding that justice is rarely loud. It's cumulative. By the time the consequences fully settled, they belonged to him alone. My role was finished. All I had to do was live forward and allow time to complete the work I had already set in motion, without regret, resentment, hesitation, or need to look back. It has been 5 years since that night, and my life no longer feels loud. I wake up most mornings just before 7, not because an alarm demands it, but because my body knows peace now. The house is quiet in a way that feels safe, not empty. My days are simple. Work that challenges me without consuming me. Meals eaten slowly. Conversations that don't require performance. I learned that stability isn't about holding everything together. It's about knowing what to let go of. I no longer replay the past looking for alternate endings. Healing didn't arrive as a victory lap or a dramatic reinvention. It showed up in boundaries I keep without explaining, and in relationships that don't ask me to shrink. There is strength in choosing calm after chaos. I understand now that walking away wasn't the boldest thing I did. Staying aligned with myself afterward was, I don't measure success by what I survived anymore. I measure it by how I live, by the steadiness of my breath, by the absence of fear in my decisions, by the quiet confidence that comes from trusting myself again. This life didn't happen by accident. It was built deliberately, one clear choice at a time, and now I can finally see the meaning. It feels honest, grounded, and completely my own. I learned that strength does not always announce itself. Sometimes it looks like silence, patience, and the decision to choose clarity over chaos. Walking away was not about winning. It was about refusing to lose myself. If you are listening to this and feeling confused, doubting your instincts, or shrinking to keep the peace, I want you to know something. You are not weak for noticing what does not feel right. You are not dramatic for wanting truth. Respect begins the moment you stop explaining your boundaries. I did not heal by becoming louder or harder. I healed by becoming clearer, by trusting myself again, by understanding that love should never require blindness. Whatever season you are in right now, remember this. You do not owe anyone access to you when they refuse honesty. You are allowed to choose calm. You are allowed to leave quietly and still be strong. If this story resonated with you, I would love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever faced a moment where clarity changed everything? Share it in the comments. I listen.